And only 37.7% said, no, why would I create my own framework? And 62.3% said, yes, of course I created my own framework. Second question. Out of those people that have created their own framework, how many of you are still using a custom-built framework? Just a couple of hands now. My scientific research said, well, there's still a couple of people doing that. It's about 12%. But the main majority is not using a custom-built framework anymore, which is a good thing. So, let's have a look at why we would want to use a framework. And the main reason, and Rafael mentioned it earlier, is that people really want to reinvent the wheel for some reason. But with frameworks, you don't have to do that anymore. You can start using the wheel that someone else has invented already, which makes it a lot easier for you to start building the stuff that you really want to build. Now, obviously, some people are really good at this. But the great thing about this is also we don't have to write all of the code anymore. A lot of the code is already written. We don't have to do that anymore, and we can focus on the application logic that we really want. And another great reason, which was basically there was a discussion when Rasmus was on stage here about should PHP be cleaned up or not. Well, if you use a framework, one of the reasons why you could use a framework is because it abstracts away all of these weird things that PHP is doing, because now you have a framework in between. Another reason why you would want to use a framework is that you want to have a stable foundation to build the rest of your application on. If you build a framework and you build 6 or 7 or 10 or 15 or 100 projects on that framework, once you fix a bug in your framework, it's automatically fixed for all of your projects. Now, this is great. Because, well, okay, some people build a framework and then only use it once, so you don't really have that benefit. But if you use it more than once, you already have a benefit, because you fix it once and it's fixed in all your projects. Now, the even better thing, of course, if you go for open source frameworks, because now you're not even the one fixing the bugs anymore. Well, of course you can do that. You can contribute to open source, and you should. But now there's like thousands of people worldwide that all work on the framework that you're using. And you benefit from all of their work. And you benefit from all of their intelligence. I overheard Rafael earlier talking to someone saying, what I do is I make sure that I work with people that are smarter than me. Well, if you use an open source framework, you use the work of a lot of people that are smarter than you, or at least smarter than me. So if there are so many advantages for using an open source framework, why would we build it ourselves? Well, for instance, if you have custom needs. Most of the frameworks will do about 90% of what you want. Sometimes they won't do 100%, and it's very hard to hack that into the framework. So then you could build your own framework. You could. And of course, not invented here syndrome. We're developers. We want to build our own framework, of course. Sometimes an open source framework is an overkill. How many of you have worked with Symphony 1 or Zend Framework 1? A couple of hands. Symphony 1 and Zend Framework 1, they were both, basically, you had to use it all. And in those days, using a framework really meant you had to use everything. These days, it's a lot easier, but I'll get back to that. But the best reason why every one of you needs to build their own framework is for the learning experience. So that you know what is happening under the hood of the framework that you're using. Build your own framework, really. Go build your own framework, and then throw it away. and use an open source framework. Surely there's more reasons, but these are the most common reasons why I hear people say they build their own framework. Now, 3, maybe even 2 years ago, if you told me that I would tell you it is okay to build your own framework, I would have been laughing really hard. Why would I want to build my own framework? That's stupid. But now I'm here, and I'm going to tell you it's okay to build your own framework. That's fine. However, and this is the most important part, it is not okay to write all of the code for it yourself. Because there's so much already available. Why would you not use that power? Well, okay, actually, there's reasons why you would need to build everything yourself. For instance, if you work in the military or in certified, really high-grade certified companies for security reasons, because if you want to pull in an external library, they have to do a code review of all of that code, while it is probably easier and faster to build just what you need yourself. So there's reasons for it. For all of the other situations, use the source. Wrong movie. Open source. So earlier this week, I was preparing the slides, reviewing the slides, making sure that everything is up to date. And I was checking Twitter. Well, so I wasn't reviewing the slide. I was checking Twitter, and a set of tweets came by, which basically summarizes part of my talk. Bart said, "These days, we don't really need a framework anymore for simple applications. Patching together components like Xent, Deactorus, Symphony routing, it does the job. And if you add Twig and a dependency injection container, you really got something. And it makes your code nearly 100% framework agnostic." Now, that's one of the things that I'm going to tell you today, is that this is actually possible these days. It's so easy, and I'm going to show you. The main component, the main reason why it is so easy these days, is Composer. How many people use Composer? That's lots of hands. Very good. For those that are unfamiliar with Composer so far, go and read up on Composer. It is a package manager that allows you to easily install specific components. It sets it up, it configures it, it makes sure that the auto-loading is available so you can start coding immediately. And Composer combined with packages, which is the default, will give you basically access to just about every bit of open source PHP code out there. Basically, all of these open source packages are like the individual transformers for the Constructicons. They're already quite powerful on their own, but once you start combining them together, you get a really strong thing. You get Devastator, the ultimate machine. So, let's have a look at what a basic framework consists of. Let's assume I'm going to build a web application. So the first thing I need to do is make sure that I can handle the request that comes in and that I can send the response back. This is pretty basic. If I were doing something for command line instead of web, I would still be having something like this, but it would not be HTTP request, it would be command line command. Basically something like that. We're doing a web application right now. And then once we can handle the requests, we need to make sure that we have something that can do the routing so that I can have multiple URLs with different functionality. So we're going to pull that in as well. And then, so once upon a time, long ago, it was very normal to have PHP and HTML mixed up. Rasmus was telling about that earlier. Now, the code that Rasmus was showing this morning, not even me is that old to remember that. But I still remember mixing up PHP and HTML. So we don't want to mix that up anymore. So I'm going to add a templating engine so that I can separate the HTML fully from my business logic. And then I want to have some configuration in there, because when I'm working on development, I don't want my production settings. So I need some kind of configuration to make a difference between production and development. And of course, I want to send some email, so I'm going to add the sending of email to my own custom framework. And last but not least, since we're sending some email and I'm going to take some user input, I want to do some validation to make sure that whatever I get from the user is actually what I expect. So that's all nice. This is, if you look at most of the frameworks out there, this is basically the core of every framework. It's handling requests, doing some templating, some configuration. Well, there's some bit more to most frameworks, but this is the basis. So let's have a look at some code. So the first thing I need to do, since I'm using Composer, and I have a brand new project, I have an empty directory, I want to get started, is do Composer init, which basically tells Composer, I'm starting a new project. It will ask me for a couple of questions, I answer the questions, and I end up with a composer.json file, which looks something like this. You can basically ignore most of this for now, but the most important thing is there's some information, some meta information about your project, and there's an empty array down there which says require, and we're going to fill that with the components that we want to work with. So let's have a look at the first step, which is getting the request and sending a response. There's a lot of packages out there that do this because it is the basis of 90% of projects out there. When I was looking for it, there's a couple of interesting ones. React has one. Illuminate, which is basically Laravel, has one. Symphony has one. And I'm pretty much a fan of Symphony framework. And I'm pretty familiar with how Symphony works, so I'm going to pick Symphony HTTP Foundation to handle the request and the response. So I do Composer require Symphony HTTP Foundation, and automatically Composer will download the right package for me and will add it to my composer.json file. So now my require array has Symphony HTTP Foundation version 3.1 in this case. And it's already downloaded, it's installed in the vendor folder, it's there. I can now start using it. But I don't have anything yet where I can use it. So I create my document root, a web folder, and in the web folder I create index.php, which is basically this for now. Now this is one of the things for those of you that are old enough to remember the time before Composer. We had to set up all of our autoloading, and every open source package had a different naming scheme. So you had like a huge configuration for all of the autoloading. Or there were even times before autoloading, but let's not go into that. Composer makes it very easy. They do all the autoloading. The only thing I need to do is to require the autoloader that has been generated by Composer. And now, I can handle the request and the response. I create a request, I create a response object, and to the response object in this case, I pass the great example, hello world. And by calling send on the response, it will send the response back to the client. I have a working application. It cost me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and that's only because I use new lines. I could have done it in 3 lines. That's all I need to do to create a hello world. And the great thing is, I even have a dynamic hello world. If I pass question mark name is Stefan, it will say hello Stefan instead of hello world. Great, awesome. We just created a hello world with a single component and 3 lines of code. Of course, I don't know about you, most of my projects consist of more logic than just hello world. So I want to have multiple URLs, and each URL should handle specific bit of code, specific bit of logic, and send a different response. Now, for routing, again, there's a dozen packages out there that can do routing. The most obvious one for me would be Symphony routing. But then if I start pulling in all of these Symphony packages, I could have just downloaded Symphony, which is not a good reason or a good idea as an example for this talk. So I'm going to skip that one. Well, Laravel obviously has a routing package. Zen Framework has a routing package. But really, when I started looking into the routing, there is only one package that is worth considering. And that's FastRoute. FastRoute is an extremely simple package for routing. You'll see that in a minute when I show it to you. And it's very flexible. So I do the same thing as I did before. I do compose require, and it's installed, and now I can start using it. So I hope this is readable in the back. Not sure. This is a bit of code that sets up basically two routes. I'm gonna zoom in. So this is the first one. I created dispatcher, and I pass a collection of routes to that dispatcher. And where the do stuff here is, I have to do stuff. I have to configure the routes. So let's look at the routes. The routes are very simple, basically. I say add route for method get. The route is /hello, and then I pass an anonymous function. And basically, when the router matches this specific route, this specific set of requirements, it must be a get and it must be going to /hello, then this will be my controller. I could have instantiated a controller class here, but then I would be writing a lot of code, and the whole idea is that I write just a little bit of code. And the great thing is, I've actually added a second route as well. It's also a get. It's for /goodbye. It's basically the same thing, except that the first says hello world, and the second one says goodbye world. Yeah, so this is what I mentioned. This is what I mentioned. OK. So everything I did so far, there's something going wrong. Well, OK. Everything what I did so far was actually mostly configuration. And now, OK, something's going wrong here in my slides. Let's move on. I want to make it a bit more dynamic because I hate URLs that have question mark name equals something. So I want to make pretty URLs. So now I have /hello and then /name in brackets. Putting them in brackets basically means that it's an optional argument. So /hello matches this route without anything, and /hello/Stefan also matches this route, but then the name parameter is filled with my value. If I would leave out the square brackets, it would always require that parameter, which is obviously possible. So now I need to pass the parameters. I need to get that from the route, and this is the part of the code that was missing earlier. I need to actually execute the routing. And then in this case, because I now have parameters, I need to get the parameters from the route and add it to the function that I'm calling. It works. Now I have not a Hello World application anymore, but I have multiple routes that each have their own bit of logic in it. But one thing that's still a problem is that I still return a response with, hard-coded strings in there. So I'm going to add some templating. And when I started preparing this talk, as you mentioned, as you saw in the earlier two examples, the earlier two components, I started looking for a lot of different components that could be used and picked one. And for templating, okay, so there's a couple of options for templating. Zeta Components has one. There's Eden Template. But really, all you need is Twig. If you want templating, just go for Twig. It's so extremely powerful, and it's very easy to use. So again, I do Composer Require, we know that. I have to set up my Twig environment. So basically what I'm saying here is I load my Twig templates from the file system. They're in a directory one level higher than my document root, and then it's called views. All of my templates are in views. And then I set up the environment, and I configure a cache directory, because Twig does some caching under the hood. I have to pass this Twig instance, obviously, to my configuration, my routing configuration, so that I can use it in the anonymous function. And now, instead of doing new response, hello Stefan, hello world, I render hello.twig and pass the name parameter along. And now my Twig templates, if I want to keep doing the same thing, are like this. But now I can easily add a bunch of HTML here without polluting my PHP code. And actually, because Twig is so awesome, you can include other templates, snippets of templates. You can use template inheritance. So you have a base template, and all of the lower templates just override specific parts of that base template. All of that stuff I can now use because I use Twig, which is really nice. Now, let's do that configuration thing. The worst thing that can happen, well, not the worst thing, but one of the annoying things that can happen is, for instance, if you want to send out an email and you're testing on your development environment and you refresh 10 times, your support desk actually gets 10 emails with just test data. That's annoying, right? Or if you put in your own email address and then accidentally deploy that to production and you get all the email from the production system. That's maybe even more annoying. So we want to have something that can handle configuration so that we can make a difference between the dev environment, your test environment, your production environment. There's a couple of options there. Symphony has an option. Laravel has an option. There is a package called Packaged, which looked pretty okay. But then I found this one, Works Config, which is really easy and really nice. So I'm skipping the whole Composer Require. I think you know that by now. I set up the configuration, which is basically just instantiating the object and telling them what configuration file to load. And then I can pass that configuration to this part. I set up a new route for a contact form. And right now, I just render a form, right? Because I don't need to configure anything here yet. I just want to display the form. So this is the form. It's a basic form. I ask for a name, email address, and a message so people can tell me how awesome this website is. And now it gets interesting, because now I need to handle this post. So I create a new route for the post. And this is what I'm doing now. I create a mail body, and then I mail to, in this case, the hard-coded email address, which is my email address, with the subject and then the mail body. There it is. An email gets sent. Now this is where the problem lies. It's still hard-coded. I want to configure that. Oh, there are the compulsory queries. This is what I mentioned earlier. You set up a simple configuration class. You pass a provider to it, which basically tells the configuration loader, you know, in this case, I expect a JSON file. And there's also XML, there's PHP. I think there's YAML as well. So you can choose whichever you want. And then this is where the magic happens. Because I use the JSON provider here, it will automatically start looking for config.json. So as long as I configure my email address in that file, I can now get it from the config object. So I pass config to my post route, and now I can just use config get contact email. And as long as there's a contact_email configured in that file, I'm fine. I'm going to use particle validator. Particle validator is a relatively small library, but it's very clean and very simple. I compose a require it, and this is basically what I need to do. I create a new validator, and I tell the validator, okay, I need a name field, an email field, and a message field. All three of them are required. The name is a string, the email is an email, and the message is a string. Now, if I want to do more complex validations, I can write my own validators, just like email and string. But for now, these are the basics, and that's fine. The only thing I need to do now is call this validator, check if the result is valid. If it's valid, then I can send the email. If it's not valid, I just pass an array of errors to my template so I can show the errors. That's all. So, just to summarize, there is valid use cases for building your own framework. But when you do, really you shouldn't have to write everything yourself. If you start using open source components with Composer, and you only have to write a bit of glue code, I think in total this is about 60 or 70 lines of code. And then of course I've shown you, you know, how to build that. So some other stuff, some other components that you could look into is if you want to do dependency injection, there's Disco, there's Symphony dependency injection, League of Extraordinary Packages has one. If you want to do command line applications instead of web applications, there's a couple of options, but I would really tell you just to use Symphony Console because it is the best out there. If you want to do HTTP requests, basically same thing, just use Guzzle. It's the best one out there at this moment. And the same for logging. So, basically, what I've shown you is how to do this. How to create this great thing out of all these small components. I need to give some credits for the photos because they are awesome. Especially these icons. James Peng is awesome. Thank you very much.
Any
5
questions?
minutes or something?
Yeah, that's okay. I myself have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
In your aspect, what defines between a framework and a boilerplate? Because what I saw from your examples is that I require packages, but I also add some stuff myself in my projects or custom stuff. But when should I call that code a framework, or is that still boilerplate?
Yeah. The thing with your question is, what is the difference between boilerplate and a framework? Both are stuff that you have to repeat for every project.
Yeah.
So both are basically the same thing. The only difference, I guess, maybe, is that boilerplate is pretty standard. It's always the same. And with a custom framework like this, you could mix and match just what you need for the project and nothing else. So there's a bit more variety, I guess, when you build a framework.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. Any more questions? Sorusu olan?
I won't bite, I promise. No more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. This is my blog, and you can find me on Twitter.